my water just broke. I felt like things really intensified.
She was right there and she was coming.
It was an amazing feeling.
I'm going to cry just thinking about it. I could feel her head.
We heard her cry. We were squeezing hands and she was screaming.
I'm Bryn Hunt Palmer, and you're listening to The Birth Hour. This podcast is designed as a safe place to come together and share childbirth stories. Stick around and join us to hear informative and empowering birth journeys from all over the world. Today's birth story guest is Danielle, who's going to be sharing her induction birth story at 42 weeks. Hi, Danielle. Welcome to The Birth Hour. Thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Can you tell my listeners just a little bit about you and your family before we get into your story?
Sure. So my name is Danielle Walish. I live in New York City with my husband and now 22-month-old daughter. I am the co-founder of Madri Collection, which is a clothing line designed for breastfeeding moms.
Great. Well, I'm sure we'll hear more about the kind of birth of the company as well. But let's start with your pregnancy and the type of birth that you were planning once you found out you were pregnant.
Sure. So when I found out I was pregnant, I was pretty much in shock. So a funny thing happened about 2 weeks before I had found out. My best friend of nearly 20 years had told me that she was pregnant. And when she told me, I was just ecstatic that I was basically going to become an aunt. And then about 2 weeks later, I was late for my period and said to my husband, I think I should take a pregnancy test. So after taking 4 pregnancy tests, I was also pregnant. So it was really exciting because I was about to go through my first pregnancy with my best friend who I experienced pretty much everything with leading up to that. So, it was my first pregnancy, and I had no idea what was in store for me. But what I did know was I was going to read and research and figure out exactly how I wanted my pregnancy and later birth to go. Being a yoga practitioner, I was really approaching my pregnancy with, a very kind of mindful intention of taking care of myself, continuing my practice, researching the best prenatal vitamins to take. And when I started to think about really giving birth, I asked a couple friends of mine the best sort of textbooks to read. And everyone had suggested the writings of Ina May Gaskin, the sort of seminal midwife. So I went on Amazon, I bought her books and I read them. Really, they were my Bible throughout my pregnancy. I ended up going with a medical OBGYN practice instead of a midwife, although they did have a midwife as part of the practice, mainly because, it was my first pregnancy. I said, God forbid something went wrong. I do want to be in a hospital setting. Luckily, the practice that I went with in Soho called Spring OBGYN, they were sort of very open to all of my sort of more kind of natural hippy-dippy inclinations when it came to having the baby and thinking about a birth plan. When we talked about the birth plan, I really wanted to have a drug-free labor. I wasn't planning on having an epidural, for instance. I wanted to be able to be mobile in the room. My husband and I met with a prenatal masseuse who sort of trained him on what he could do while I was in labor in terms of massage technique. And my doctors at Spring were totally on board for all of it. They were encouraging me to, think about if it doesn't go to plan, how am I going to feel about that? But they were very open to all of my requests and on board.
Do you want to go ahead and get into kind of those final weeks of pregnancy leading up to the birth?
Totally. So at about 39 weeks, I was at the doctor's office every week leading up to the birth at that point, we started to talk about what the next few days would look like. And it was my first pregnancy again, so I had no idea what to expect. But, my due date was January 2nd. And I just expected to sort of go into labor naturally, as I had read about in all of the books that I had read, and was doing all of the things that people told me to do to sort of induce natural labor in terms of continuing to walk and exercise and just stay calm, and really kind of like think about and meditate on, the baby coming. And then once we hit the due date, she seemed very comfortable and there was no sign of her coming out. So, the doctors started to bring up the idea of induction, but it was still, only the due date. And it's very common to go over your due date. In fact, I think like the average, and maybe better than I do, but I think the average is 10 days that people go past their due date. So when I hit the 1 week overdue mark, that's when the doctors started to really talk to me about scheduling the induction. And I was pretty resistant because at that point, I really still felt like I would go into labor naturally. So they were really hoping to have me scheduled for induction at 10 weeks over the due date. And I did everything I could to negotiate with them to push it to exactly 2 weeks over the due date. So at 42 weeks pregnant. It took some convincing, but after a couple of doctors in the practice talked to each other, they, agreed that that was the latest they would advise me to go. So we went ahead, we scheduled the induction for exactly 2 weeks after the due date. And in the meantime, at that point I was, a little over a week overdue. I still was convinced that I would go into labor naturally. So I thought to myself, okay, I have a few days. I can start to do all of the things that I've read about to put myself into labor, and this, my water will break, and I'll go into labor naturally, and this baby will come, and I'll have the birth that I have been envisioning now for over 9 months at that point. So for the days leading up to the day she actually was born, I would walk. I lived in Brooklyn at the time. My sister-in-law lived around the corner from me. It was the dead of winter. It was very cold, but we would wake up in the morning and take a very long walk, about 6 miles, I would say, which was not that comfortable when you're that pregnant and it's that cold out. I would bounce on this big yoga ball for, no joke, probably, overall 2 to 3 hours of the day, just bouncing on a ball. I exercised. I went to yoga. Towards the very end, I even did like dance aerobics, thinking that maybe the jumping around would help the baby come out. And every day was sort of a roller coaster, because I would wake up in the morning and say, just so excited and say, this is the day the baby's going to come today. And then she wouldn't. So it was sort of like by 4 o'clock every day with no sign of going into labor, then I would just have a meltdown, and it was really emotional. And my husband would have to sort of talk me down from, it was such a mix of emotions, from being just so excited for this baby to come. And I also did not mention, but I didn't know if I was having a girl or a boy. So, the anticipation of finding out who this baby was going to be. And then also the fear of just feeling like, what if there's something wrong, even though my doctors kept assuring me that everything was fine. So I would say by once I was about 12 days overdue, I started to reach the end of the list of things you can do to put yourself into labor naturally. I tried to get my hands on castor oil that I could ingest, but ended up not being able to find it. So I didn't end up drinking the castor oil, but I did about everything else, including asking my husband to basically nurse me, which is probably the most extreme thing that I did. And, and that's like not even talking about, we definitely were having intercourse to try to have the baby. And it's like at that point when you're just like, we just got to do this because the baby has to come. But so that came before. And then ultimately the last thing, which I don't know, my husband would probably die if he knew I was sharing this. But I was like, I read that like if you can, sort of trick the body into thinking that like there's a baby nursing you, then you'll induce labor. That didn't work either. So at that point, it was pretty apparent that this baby was just really comfortable in the womb and wasn't going to come out until we forced her to come out. We didn't know it was a girl at that point. So it was Sunday, January 15th. My parents came in to Brooklyn. My husband and I and my parents, the four of us, had dinner together. The waiter was placing bets on if I was going to have a boy or girl. He assured me that it was a boy. Then they drove us to the hospital and dropped us off. And I, it was pretty bizarre because it was like almost like they were dropping me off like at a school trip or something. It's like my parents drove us to the hospital and they were like, all right, we'll see you tomorrow and you'll have a baby. And it was a little bizarre. And, we got there and checked in. And it was very calm, and it was about 9:00 at night. And at 9:30, the doctor came in and said, we're going to start by giving you a Foley balloon. So the only reason why I was familiar with a Foley balloon was because my friend that I had mentioned earlier, who was also induced with her daughter for different reasons, she had one and told me that it was very painful. So I was pretty nervous about getting that, but it's basically, a balloon that they insert and fill with, I think like a saline solution, like it's supposed to dilate you more. So that was the first kind of step. And then they started me on Pitocin. So, at that point I had come to terms with the fact that my birth wasn't going to be drug-free, but I did kind of hope to avoid getting an epidural. So they started me on the Pitocin and asked me if I wanted to get an epidural. And at that point I declined and, said, let me try this out. So the first couple hours were totally fine. Then I would say by like the fourth hour of being on the Pitocin, the contractions went from like maybe a 2 to all of a sudden an 8. And it was like instant. So there was like my body was, not sort of getting prepared, I think, for the pain of the contractions. And it was very, very sudden. But I continued to sort of labor on no pain meds for another 2 hours. So I think it was 6 hours in total that I labored on the Pitocin with no epidural. And then at that point I vomited and was in so much pain, debilitating sort of pain, that I asked if I could get the epidural, which was probably the kind of best decision I could have made at that point. So then the anesthesiologist came in, gave me the epidural. It definitely relieved a lot of the pain pretty instantly. Then I was, at that point, once you get the epidural, you're bedridden. So, before that, I was able to kind of like move around the hospital room, bounce on the ball, all of the things that I had sort of envisioned doing. But then I was just, in bed for the rest of the labor. And then I started to feel like really, really intense pain, sort of the kind of the lower pain that you almost feel kind of like really at your butt when it's nearing the end, when you're starting to get ready to push. And, I thought that having an epidural, you really weren't supposed to feel anything. So I was a little confused. So I was like, all right, great. I sort of gave up on this idea of having this totally natural birth, but like I'm still feeling the pain. So what's going on here? So I had called one of the nurses in and she was like, oh, your pump for the epidural is malfunctioning. We need to get the anesthesiologist back in here to fix it, but he's in the OR right now. So you're going to have to wait probably another hour until they can come back. So that was a bummer. And so I waited, came back, he fixed the pump, and he was like, I'm going to give you something a little bit more to like take the edge off. And at that point, I think I don't even know if they just like give me a bigger dosage or something, but it like that completely alleviated anything. And then I really did not feel any of the pain from the contractions, and it was the vibe was very, very relaxed in the room at that point. And then I would say probably about 40 minutes after that, my doctor came in and told me that I was ready to start pushing. She took down the epidural so that I could feel everything while I pushed, which I did. And I pushed for a while, about an hour and a half, I think, in total. I can still feel what that felt like. It didn't feel like what I thought it would feel like, but and still thinking about the whole labor in general, that to me wasn't the most painful part. The most painful part was definitely the really intense contractions that happened seemingly instantly. So I pushed for an hour and a half, and the doctor pulled the baby out and told us that we had a girl, which I was very excited about. They didn't cut the cord right away. They just took her out, put her right on top of my chest, and she stayed there for a little bit of time, which was still like the most surreal and incredible experience of my life. And I think that when thinking back to it, I remember first seeing her face, and I think part of the reason why it did feel so surreal was she looked, and still does, exactly like my husband. And it was like this weird moment of being like, oh my God, this is like the baby version of my husband, but like, it's not, it's a new person, and it's a girl. And it's like, it was just so many feelings and reactions. And it was really incredible. And then my husband cut the umbilical cord, and they took her and cleaned her up and wrapped her in a blanket and brought her back to us. And I nursed her, I would say, pretty shortly after that for the first time. That was it. I mean, it was definitely happened the way it was, sort of supposed to happen. And I think that I came to terms with not exactly having the birth plan that I had envisioned before I had gone into labor. I had a lot of time to sort of think about it, and even just the day leading up to the induction, I sort of had made peace with the fact that, okay, this is going to be a truly kind of medical labor, and that's okay, because, all that matters is that I have a healthy baby at the end of it. I think in retrospect, or if I were to ever be induced again, I think I would get the epidural as soon as I could. But I'm still sort of hoping, if I'm lucky enough to have another baby, that maybe the next one will be more of this sort of Ina May Gaskin inspired birth. I think I would work with a midwife after, even after having this experience. And yeah, I think that pretty much kind of sums up the actual birth itself.
So you're thinking that if you were going to have an induction, you kind of know what that feels like, and then you would want an epidural, but hopefully you would go into labor before that became necessary, and you would want to do the unmedicated route again?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if I were to have an induction again, I would for sure get an epidural right away. And, it's just sort of really know what to expect now. However, I still am hopeful that I'll go into labor naturally the next time around. I just want to know what that feels like. I want to know what, your water breaking naturally feels like, and, getting ready to just kind of go and deliver this baby, and all of the sort of things that I've heard about from friends, and even my mother. She had 4 kids, labored naturally for all 4 of us. I still want to know what that feels like, but if I don't get to, it's also not like earth shattering.
So how was your postpartum experience?
So my postpartum experience was really, really wonderful for a number of reasons. First, I would say I was really lucky because I had a lot of support and help from family members. So I had mentioned my brother and sister-in-law lived literally around the corner from us. So they were over our apartment all of the time. And then my daughter's the first grandchild. So her grandparents are obviously obsessed with her. And my parents actually they live in New Jersey, but they ended up renting an apartment 3 blocks away from us in Brooklyn so that my mom could be there during the week and they could spend the weekends there. Which was really, really amazing because, my daughter has this incredible bond with my mother because she was so involved from day one. And, unfortunately, my husband's mother had passed away before she was born. So, she is very lucky that she has, such a close relationship with my mother. So having just all of the help and the support made the postpartum experience really, really kind of easy for me. And I also had like a small tear from labor, but it was very minor. So my recovery was pretty effortless. I was able to breastfeed really, really easily, which I'm still breastfeeding my daughter. It's been an incredible experience for us. And for me in particular, because, I wasn't really sure how I was going to feel about breastfeeding. I knew that I wanted to try to do it, but I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to, if I was going to have the supply that I needed, if I was going to have to supplement with formula. And, the more and more I read about it and the more and more I did it and sought out support when I needed it, I went to I had mentioned my best friend who had a baby shortly before I did. She was very involved with going to La Leche League meetings, and she brought me to one. And, I was like, it was empowering because I was like, okay, I could do this. And there's like other moms who are doing this. My mom had breastfed all of us, and it came pretty, it just was a very sort of seamless experience for us. That being said, I definitely met with a lactation consultant before leaving the hospital, and I went to sort of a lactation meeting. And so it didn't just like happen. Like I really kind of learned the principles of what I needed to be doing and how I needed to be holding her and what a good latch was versus, a not great latch. So it definitely helped though in the postpartum, experience of like, because it's so amazing the way you feel after you give birth. But once that sort of all settles, I could understand why, people go through a depression because it's, you've been pregnant for so long and then all of a sudden you're not. And it's like almost mourning that like you have this new baby, obviously, which is, everything, but it's also like that time you spent with the baby inside of you is gone, and you're sort of mourning that as well. So being able to breastfeed is so incredible because you still have that physical bond with the baby, and emotionally it calms the mother, and it just does such amazing things for both the baby and the mother. So I was really lucky because I mentioned that I had all this support from my family and also my friends, but everyone's also very supportive of me breastfeeding, which I think is always like the first step in having a good experience with breastfeeding.
So with all of the support you had and just trial and error on your own, do you have any specific resources that you want to recommend that you haven't mentioned yet?
So I did have my placenta turned into pills. So this was a friend of mine had done it, and she highly, highly recommended it. And I was like, you know what? I would do it. Like I'm open. And there's, whether it's a placebo effect or not, I do think that taking the placenta pills really, really helped me in the postpartum recovery. I think I healed really quickly because of it. It's supposed to help with, postpartum depression, but, whether or not like the science actually proves that, I'm not sure, but I highly, highly recommend doing that. I think it really, really did help me in the recovery period.
Awesome. Well, did you want to share where people can find you to connect online?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I did with my best friend that I keep bringing up, who also had a child at the same time, is we started actually a clothing line for mothers who are breastfeeding or nursing or pumping at work called Madri Collection. And it was really kind of born out of this idea that we just really couldn't find anything we wanted to wear where we could nurse our babies really effortlessly in. So you can find us at Madri Collection on Instagram. And, any sort of questions or, we really want to be this place of support for breastfeeding moms. So please get in touch.
Perfect. Well, I'll link to that from the show notes page. And thank you so much for sharing your story with me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, head to thebirthhour.com and click Become a Member to pledge your support. And as a thank you, you'll get an invitation to join our private Facebook group and access to exclusive episodes. Your vote of confidence and support means the world to me.